The year was 2487, and humanity had finally spread beyond its home star. Colony ships had carried millions to distant worlds, and the blue marble called Earth was no longer the only place humans called home. But in the grand map of the galaxy, humanity was still small, still young, still watched. The Galactic Council ruled most of the Orion Arm. Over 600 species sat in its great halls, and its laws stretched across thousands of star systems. The Council decided who could trade, who could expand, and who could build warships. And for species like humanity, the rules were clear. Stay in your corner, keep your fleet small, and do not make trouble. Earth's government obeyed mostly. The United Stellar Navy had 200 ships, the maximum the Council allowed. Human colonies grew slowly, boxed in by borders they did not choose. And every few years, some council official would remind humanity that it should be grateful for what it had. But the galaxy was not completely unkind. Among the hundreds of species that filled the stars, there was one that had stood beside humanity when no one else would. The Valorans. The Valoran Dominion was not a mighty empire. They were a quiet, gentle people. Tall, insectoid beings with soft bioluminescent skin that glowed in shades of blue and gold. They built cities of living crystal on their homeworld of Vala Prime and its 3 moons. They were scientists, healers, and artists. They had no interest in war. When the first human colony ships had been turned away by Council patrols decades ago, lost and running low on fuel in unfamiliar space, it was the Valorans who opened their borders. They gave the humans food, shelter, and fuel. They asked for nothing in return. And from that moment, a bond was formed that neither species would ever forget. Over the years, the alliance grew deep. Valoran medical science had saved millions of human lives during the Terran Plague of 2461, when a virus swept through Earth's outer colonies, and the Council refused to send aid. Human engineers helped the Valorans build better orbital platforms and defense stations. Valoran children studied at universities on Earth. Human families visited Vala Prime and marveled at the glowing towers that sang in the wind. Ambassador Lyrae Velshan was the living symbol of that bond. She was the Valoran representative to Earth, a tall and graceful figure whose skin shimmered with soft golden light when she spoke. She had lived among humans for 15 years. Her daughter, barely an adolescent by Valoran standards, attended school in Geneva. Lyrae understood humans in a way few aliens ever could. She understood their laughter, their stubbornness, and their fierce loyalty to those they loved. Her closest friend among the humans was Admiral Kale Morrow, the commander of Earth's first expeditionary fleet. Morrow was a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and a quiet voice that could fill a room without ever rising. He had visited Vala Prime 6 times. He had eaten at Valoran tables, learned to play their string instruments badly, and once carried a lost Valoran child through a rainstorm back to her family. The Valoran children on Vala Prime called him Sky Uncle in their clicking language, and the name always made him smile. On a cold morning on Mars, Morrow and Lyrae stood side by side at a memorial for the human colonists who had died in the early expansion years. A Valoran choir sang a hymn of remembrance, their voices blending with human violins, a moment that felt like it could last forever. But it would not. Far away, in the gleaming council halls on Arxis Prime, something ugly was growing. The Arxelian hegemony, the cold and calculating reptilian species that had dominated council politics for centuries, had turned its attention to the Vala cluster. Not because of the Valorans themselves. The Arxelians cared nothing for art or crystal cities. They cared about what lay beneath the surface of Valoran worlds. Etherium. Etherium was a rare mineral, quantum reactive, and almost impossible to synthesize. It was the key to the next generation of faster-than-light drives, and whoever controlled the supply would control the future of galactic travel. The Valorans had vast reserves of it, buried deep in their moons, and they had refused, politely but firmly, to hand over control to the Council. The Arxelians were not used to being told no. Beside them stood the Dravosi theocracy, a fanatically religious avian species that believed the galaxy belonged to the chosen races, and that lesser species existed only to serve. The Dravosi had never liked the Valorans. They considered them weak, unworthy, and their alliance with humanity, a species the Dravosi considered barely above animals, was an insult to the natural order. Together, the Arxelians and the Dravosi called a secret session of the Council. Human delegates were not invited. Valoran delegates were not informed. In a closed chamber, with only loyal species present, a resolution was passed. The Valoran Dominion was declared a destabilizing entity. The language was careful and bureaucratic, but the meaning was simple. The Council had just given itself permission to destroy the Valorans. Word reached Earth through back channels. Quiet warnings from sympathetic species who disagreed with the vote but were too afraid to speak publicly. The message was clear: distance yourself from the Valorans, or face consequences. The warning landed on the desk of President Hidara Osei. She was a tall woman from West Africa, with sharp eyes and a spine made of steel. She had grown up on stories of what the Valorans had done for humanity. She had met Ambassador Lirai personally. She had held the hand of a Valoran healer who had saved her nephew during the plague. She read the warning twice. Then she stood before the cameras and spoke to every human in the galaxy. "We have been told to abandon our friends," she said, her voice steady and clear. "We have been told that loyalty is a weakness, and that obedience is the price of survival. But I say this: Earth does not abandon its friends. Not today. Not ever. If the Council believes it can bully us into silence, it does not understand what it means to be human." The speech echoed across colony worlds. It played on screens in cafes on Mars, in mining stations on Titan, in the cramped quarters of cargo ships crossing the void. And everywhere it played, humans nodded. Because they remembered. They remembered who had helped them when no one else would. On Arxis Prime, the Arxelian High Commander Thalvex Aurum watched the broadcast with narrow yellow eyes. He turned to his aide and said, "Humans are sentimental creatures. They will bark for a while, then fall in line. They always do." He was wrong. He was very, very wrong. The attack came without warning. There was no ultimatum, no demand for surrender, no final negotiation or last chance to comply. One moment, the skies above Vela Prime were filled with the soft glow of orbiting stations and the gentle hum of cargo ships moving between the moons. The next moment, the sky was full of fire. Over 4,000 warships dropped out of hyperspace in a single coordinated wave. Arxelian dreadnoughts, long and dark like iron blades. Dravosi cruisers, covered in religious symbols and bristling with weapons. Mercenary frigates, hired from a dozen species, paid in advance and pointed at a target that could not fight back. They filled the space around the Vela cluster like a swarm of metal locusts, and they opened fire before the Valorans even knew they were there. The Valoran defense fleet was small. It had been built for patrol and protection, not for war. 63 ships crewed by brave souls who had never expected to fight a battle like this. They launched from their stations and formed a line between the enemy and their homeworld. And they held that line for as long as they could, 90 minutes. That was all the time they had. 90 minutes of desperate fighting before the last Valoran warship broke apart, and its crew was scattered into the void. Then the bombardment began. Orbital cannons turned toward Vela Prime. Plasma rained down on cities that had stood for thousands of years. The great crystal towers of the capital, structures that had taken generations to grow, shattered in seconds. Bio-like gardens that glowed with the colors of a sunset were burned black. Schools, hospitals, temples, nothing was spared. The Arxelians did not aim for military targets because there were almost none. They aimed at everything. On the 3 inhabited moons, it was the same. Colonies that had existed in peace for centuries were reduced to rubble in hours. Underground shelters cracked open under the force of deep penetration warheads. Whole populations were buried alive. 6 hours. In 6 hours, billions of Valorans were dead. And it did not stop there. As the cities burned, refugee ships began to launch from every corner of the Vela cluster. Small transports, civilian shuttles, cargo haulers, packed with families, anything that could fly and carry people away from the fire. They fled in every direction, broadcasting distress signals on every open frequency, begging for anyone to hear them. The Dravosi were waiting. Containment patrols had been positioned at every major hyperspace exit point around the cluster. Their orders were simple: nothing leaves. When the first wave of refugee ships arrived, the Dravosi commander ordered them to turn back. Some did, flying back into the burning cluster with nowhere left to go. Others refused, pushing forward in desperation, hoping that speed or luck would carry them through. The Dravosi opened fire on them. Transports full of families were torn apart by weapons designed to destroy warships. Bodies tumbled into the vacuum. Emergency pods were shot as they ejected. And through it all, intercepted communications revealed Dravosi officers laughing. Laughing at the sight of unarmed ships breaking apart. Laughing at the distress calls of mothers trying to shield their children. Those recordings would reach human intelligence networks within hours, and they would change everything. On Earth, Ambassador Liray Velshan was in her office when the first distress signals arrived. She was reviewing a cultural exchange proposal. Something about a new Valoran art exhibit planned for London. A normal day, a quiet day. Then her communications console lit up with priority alerts, one after another, faster than she could read them. She opened the first message and saw real-time telemetry from Vela Prime. Thermal readings that showed the surface temperature of her homeworld rising by hundreds of degrees. Satellite imagery that showed mushroom clouds where cities used to be. Audio recordings of Valoran emergency channels filled with screaming and static and then silence. Liray's skin, which normally glowed a warm gold, went dark. She tried to stand. Her legs gave out. She fell to the floor of her office and stayed there shaking as the data kept coming. Her parents were on Vela Prime, her sister, her cousins. Her childhood home, built beside a river that sang with bioluminescent fish, was inside the blast radius of the first bombardment wave. A human aide found her 20 minutes later, still on the floor, her eyes open, but seeing nothing. The news reached the halls of the United Earth Senate within the hour. Senators gathered in the Great Chamber, and the footage was played on the central display, unedited, uncensored. They saw the crystal cities fall. They saw the refugee ships shatter. They heard the laughter of the Dravosi commanders. They heard the last transmission from a Valoran transport captain, a female who had spoken calmly to her passengers, even as her ship came apart around her. "Close your eyes, little ones. The light is coming. It will not hurt." For a long moment, the Senate was silent. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of grief. It was the silence of something deeper, something older. Something that lived in the bones of every human who had ever watched someone they loved be hurt by someone stronger. Then the silence broke, and what replaced it was rage. The footage leaked within hours. It spread across every human colony world like wildfire. On Mars, factory workers stopped their shifts and gathered around screens, watching in horror. On Titan, miners wept openly. On the frontier colonies, veterans who had served alongside Valoran crews slammed their fists against tables and walls. Civilians who had never held a weapon in their lives walked into recruitment offices and asked where to sign. The reaction was not political. It was not strategic. It was personal. Every human who had ever shared a meal with a Valoran, who had been healed by Valoran medicine, who had watched their children play with Valoran children, every single one of them felt the same thing, a white-hot fury that burned away every other thought. In his quarters aboard the command station orbiting Earth, Admiral Kale Morrows stood alone. A holographic image of Vela Prime floated before him. Not the burning ruin of the present, but the world he remembered. The crystal towers catching the light of the twin suns, the markets filled with the sweet smell of Valoran spices, the sound of children clicking his nickname as they ran to greet him. He thought of Lyre, who had wept at his daughter's wedding. He thought of the Valoran healer who had sat by his bedside for 3 days when he was injured during a border skirmish, refusing to leave until she was sure he would recover. He thought of the old Valoran man who had taught him to play the string harp, and had laughed so hard at Morrow's clumsy attempts that he had fallen off his chair. All gone. All of it. Gone. Morrow's hands were shaking. He noticed them and held them up in front of his face, watching the tremor. Then, slowly, deliberately, he closed his fists. The shaking stopped. He reached for his comm unit and spoke 4 words: "Get me the President." Across the galaxy, the Galactic Council issued its formal statement. The words were smooth and carefully chosen. The Valoran Dominion had been dissolved for the continued security and stability of galactic civilization. All Valoran territories would be administered by council-appointed governors. Any species harboring Valoran fugitives would face immediate economic and military sanctions. The statement ended with a recommendation that all council members look forward to a new era of cooperation and peace. On Arxis Prime, Thalvex Aurum read the statement and smiled. Everything had gone according to plan. The Valorans were broken. And the humans, emotional, sentimental, predictable humans, would rage for a while, and then fall quiet, just as every other small species had before them. He did not notice the silence from Earth. Not yet. But he would. He would notice it very soon. President Idara Ose stood in the war room beneath the surface of Earth, 2 kilometers below the old city of Geneva. The room was carved from solid rock and lined with screens showing every corner of human space. Admirals, generals, intelligence chiefs, and senior advisors filled the long table before her. Every face was hard. Every jaw was tight. She did not waste time with speeches. She had already given one speech. Now was the time for something else. "Activate the Prometheus Doctrine," she said. The words landed like a hammer. Several officers exchanged glances. The Prometheus Doctrine was not a plan anyone had expected to hear in their lifetime. It was a classified wartime protocol, written 40 years ago and buried in the deepest vaults of Earth's military command. It had never been activated. It was designed for one scenario only: total war against a superior enemy. The doctrine authorized 3 things. First, the complete mobilization of every military asset in human space. Second, the unsealing of strategic weapons reserves hidden across the Sol system and its colonies. And third, the activation of the Black Fleet. For decades, the Galactic Council had believed that humanity had 200 warships. That was the number in the official records. That was the number human diplomats reported every year during fleet inspections. And it was a lie. The truth was that Earth had been building in secret for over 30 years, deep inside hollowed-out asteroids in the belt between Mars and Jupiter, in underground shipyards on the dark side of Titan's largest moon, in hidden facilities buried beneath the ice of Europa. Humanity had been constructing warships, not patrol vessels or escorts or diplomatic yachts. These were weapons of war, built from the ground up by engineers who knew that one day the galaxy would try to break them. Stealth dreadnoughts, 600 meters long, coated in sensor-absorbing materials that made them invisible to Council detection systems. Carrier swarms that could launch 500 fighter drones in under a minute. Siege platforms that carried weapons powerful enough to crack the crust of the moon. EMP lances that could shut down every electronic system on an enemy ship in a single pulse. Kinetic kill arrays, railguns the size of city blocks that fired tungsten rounds at a fraction of the speed of light. The Council thought humanity had 200 ships. The true number was 3,800. Admiral Morrow received his orders within the hour. He was given command of the entire combined fleet, every warship humanity possessed, from the smallest corvette to the largest dreadnought. It was the greatest concentration of military force in human history, and it was his to wield. His first order was silence. Every human military communication channel went dark. FTL communication beacons were shut down. Colony worlds stopped broadcasting. Trade ships were recalled to port. In the span of 6 hours, humanity disappeared from the galactic network as completely as if it had never existed. The Council noticed, of course. Arxelian intelligence officers flagged the communications blackout and sent inquiries through diplomatic channels. No response. They sent more. Still nothing. A Dravasi probe ship was dispatched to the edge of human space to investigate. It found the border stations empty, their lights dark, their docking bays sealed. The Council debated the silence for 2 days. Some voices urged caution. Perhaps the humans were planning something. Perhaps they should send a fleet to investigate. But the Arxelians dismissed the concern. Humans were grieving, they said. They were angry but powerless. Their little fleet of 200 ships was no threat to the 4,000 vessels the Council had deployed. In a few weeks, the humans would send a strongly worded protest, demand some token concession, and life would continue. They were so sure, so absolutely completely sure. While the Council debated, Earth worked. On Mars, the great foundries of Olympus City shifted to wartime production. Factories that had been building civilian transports and mining equipment began stamping out armor plating, missile casings, and reactor cores. Workers pulled double and triple shifts without being asked. Foremen who had run peaceful production lines for 20 years suddenly found themselves building weapons, and not one of them complained. On Titan, the massive fuel reserves that had been stockpiled over decades were unlocked. Tanker ships began moving the fuel to staging points across the system, feeding the hungry engines of the awakening fleet. In the asteroid belt, the hidden shipyards opened their doors for the first time. Dreadnoughts that had sat in darkness for years powered up their reactors, and their running lights blinked on, one by one, like stars being born. Crews boarded ships they had trained on in secret, ships that officially did not exist. And they ran final checks with the calm focus of people who had been preparing for this moment their entire careers. The civilian population mobilized with a fury that surprised even the military. Veterans re-enlisted by the millions. Retired pilots dusted off their flight suits. Engineers who had left the Navy decades ago returned to service within days. Civilian transport companies offered their ships for military conversion, and within a week, cargo haulers and passenger liners were being fitted with weapons and armor in orbital dry docks. Young people who had never served lined up at recruitment offices on every colony world. The lines stretched around buildings and down streets. Recruiters who had struggled to meet quotas in peacetime were now turning people away because there were not enough uniforms. And through it all, a quiet operation was running in the shadows. Human intelligence agents, spies who had been embedded in Council space for years, posing as traders, diplomats, and workers, activated their networks. They began feeding real-time data back to Earth through encrypted channels. Fleet positions, supply routes, patrol schedules, command codes, weakness points in Council ship designs. Every piece of information that could give humanity an edge was collected, verified, and sent home. At the same time, covert extraction teams slipped into the chaos of the Vela cluster. Small, fast ships crewed by special forces operators who moved through the wreckage like ghosts. Their mission was simple: find Valoran survivors and bring them out. They found them hiding in collapsed shelters, drifting in damaged escape pods, huddled in the ruins of cities that no longer existed. They brought them aboard, wrapped them in blankets, fed them, and carried them to safety. The rescued Valorans were grateful beyond words, but they also brought something invaluable: knowledge. They knew the Council fleet's weaknesses. They knew the vulnerabilities in Ethereum-based shield technology that the Council relied on. They knew the communication frequencies, the command structures, the blind spots, and they shared all of it freely, because they understood what humanity was about to do. Ambassador Lyrae, still on Earth, was briefed on the operation. She had not spoken much since the attack. Her golden glow had dimmed to almost nothing. But when she was told that human soldiers were risking their lives to save her people from the ruins, she closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a line of faint light down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the only thing she could say. It was enough. The fleet assembled in the shadow of Jupiter, hidden from Council sensors by the giant planet's massive magnetic field. 3,800 warships, arranged in battle formations that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. Dreadnoughts and carriers at the center. Wolf packs of self-destroyers on the flanks. Siege platforms in the rear, their massive guns already loaded and waiting. Admiral Morrow stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USN Remembrance. It was the largest ship in the fleet, a command dreadnought built specifically for this kind of operation. He looked out at the fleet through the bridge windows and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders. He thought of Vela Prime. He thought of the old Valoran man who had taught him to play the harp. He thought of the children who had called him Sky Uncle. He thought of the laughter of Dravosi commanders as refugee ships came apart. Then he gave the order. A single message, broadcast on every frequency, in every language known to galactic civilization. It was short, it was clear, and it was the last thing many Council commanders would ever hear. You were warned. You chose this. We are coming. On Arxis Prime, the message was received and played in the Council chamber. Thalvex Aurum listened to it with the same bored expression he wore in every meeting. He turned to his aides and shook his head. "Humans are emotional creatures," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "They will rage, then bargain, then comply. They always do." His aides nodded. They all agreed. They were all wrong. In the shadow of Jupiter, 3,800 engines roared to life, and the largest war fleet in human history began to move. The sensors on Arxis Prime detected it first. A ripple in the fabric of space-time so massive that every early warning system in the system screamed at once. Operators stared at their screens, trying to make sense of the readings. A hyperspace event of that size was not supposed to be possible. Nothing in any species' recorded history had ever produced a signature that large. Then the sky above Arxis Prime tore open. 3,800 warships dropped out of hyperspace in a single synchronized jump. They appeared in a sphere around the planet, filling every orbital lane, every approach vector, every gap in the Arxelian home defense grid. The sheer mass of so many ships exiting hyperspace at once sent a shockwave rippling outward that knocked satellites out of orbit, scrambled orbital station systems, and set off alarms on every continent of the planet below. For 10 full seconds, the Arxelian Defense Command was silent. Because they could not believe what they were seeing. Their screens showed a fleet that should not exist, from a species that should not have been able to build it, appearing at a location that should have been impossible to reach undetected. Then the panic began. The Arxillian home defense fleet scrambled from its stations, 400 ships, a respectable force under normal circumstances. Against nearly 4,000 human warships, it was a wall of paper facing a hurricane. Arxillian commanders shouted orders. Ships formed defensive lines, weapons powered up, shields activated. None of it mattered. Admiral Morrow did not fire immediately. Instead, he opened a communication channel to the council chamber on the surface below. His face appeared on every screen in the building, calm, steady, and cold in a way that made several council members physically step backward from their desks. He did not greet them. He did not make demands. He began to read. Names. He read names. The names of every Valoran world that had been destroyed. The names of every refugee ship that had been fired upon. The names of every child confirmed dead in the aftermath of the bombardment, compiled from Valoran records recovered by human extraction teams. He read for 11 minutes. His voice never wavered. His expression never changed. Name after name after name, spoken clearly into the silence of the council chamber, where 600 species watched and listened and understood, perhaps for the first time, what they had allowed to happen. When he finished, he closed the list and looked directly into the camera. You called this peacekeeping, he said. We call it what it is, and now you will answer for it. The channel closed, and the battle began. The Arxillian home fleet charged forward in a classic wedge formation, the same tactic that had won them 100 battles over the centuries. It was a formation designed to break through enemy lines and split them apart. It required the enemy to hold position and absorb the charge. The human fleet did not hold position. It moved. Wolf packs of stealth destroyers, invisible to Arxillian sensors until they were already firing, struck the flanks of the wedge from both sides. Graviton compression torpedoes, weapons the Council had never seen, slammed into Arxillian cruisers and crushed them inward, like paper cups being squeezed by a giant hand. Ships that had been 800 meters long were reduced to twisted spheres of metal in seconds. The Arxillian wedge broke apart. Captains who had never faced an enemy they could not see began firing wildly into empty space, hitting nothing, while human destroyers slipped between them like shadows. From the center of the human formation, the dreadnoughts advanced. They were enormous ships, armored beyond anything the Council had imagined possible. And they carried weapons that belonged in nightmares. Sunlance-directed energy platforms fired beams of concentrated light that cut through Arxillian capital ships from bow to stern, slicing them open like a hot wire through ice. The beams were visible from the surface of Arxis Prime. Lines of brilliant white light that streaked across the sky like the fingers of an angry god. Nanoswarm missiles launched in waves, each one carrying billions of microscopic machines that attached to enemy hulls and began eating through the metal. Ships that were not destroyed by the initial impact simply fell apart over the next few minutes, as their armor dissolved around them. The Arxillian home fleet lasted 4 hours. By the end, the space around Arxas Prime was filled with debris, shattered hulls, spinning chunks of armor, and the frozen remains of crews who had died, still trying to understand what had hit them. But the battle was not over. The Council had forces elsewhere, and they were coming. The main Council fleet, the massive armada that had destroyed the Valorans, began jumping back from the Vela cluster the moment word reached them that Arxas Prime was under attack. They came in waves, dropping out of hyperspace at predetermined rally points on the edge of the system. Morrow had planned for this. He had studied Council fleet doctrine for years, and he knew exactly where their ships would emerge. At every rally point, human stealth wolf packs were waiting. The ambushes were devastating. Council ships arrived expecting to find open space where they could form up and advance. Instead, they found kill zones. Torpedoes struck before shields could be raised. EMP lances shut down engines and weapons systems, leaving ships drifting and helpless. Railgun rounds punched through hulls at speeds that gave crews no time to react. Reinforcement wave after reinforcement wave was torn apart before it could join the fight. Council admirals who had commanded fleets for decades found themselves outmaneuvered by human tactics they had never encountered. Tactics designed not by officers who fought for territory or resources, but by officers who fought because someone had hurt the people they loved. The Dravasi Theocracy fleet was the last to arrive, and it came with religious fury. The Supreme Prelate himself broadcast a sermon as his ships advanced, calling on the divine powers to smite the human invaders and deliver righteous victory. 300 Dravasi warships charged in a formation they called the Sacred Arrow, a suicide attack designed to break through enemy lines at any cost. Human point defense networks calculated the trajectories, locked on, and opened fire. Every weapon system in the forward fleet fired simultaneously. Railguns, missile batteries, energy lances, drone interceptors. The wall of fire that met the Dravasi charge was so dense that it looked like a solid barrier of light. The Sacred Arrow shattered against it. Ships were destroyed so quickly that the ones behind them flew into the debris of the ones ahead. The charge that was supposed to be unstoppable was stopped in 4 minutes. The Supreme Prelate's flagship, damaged and burning, drifted away from the wreckage. His prayers went unanswered. No divine intervention came. As the last resistance crumbled, Moro turned his attention to the Arxelian command ship, a massive vessel called the Iron Throne of Stars, flagship of Falvex Aurum himself. It was trying to flee, its engines at full power, pushing toward the edge of the system where it could jump to hyperspace. Moro sent 3 boarding ships, human marines, armored, trained, and carrying a fury that no amount of armor could contain, breached the hull and fought their way to the bridge in 17 minutes. They found Falvex Aurum standing behind his command chair, his yellow eyes wide, his hands raised in what might have been surrender or might have been disbelief. He was brought to the bridge of the Remembrance in restraints. He expected to be killed. He had read about human history, about their wars, about what they did to defeated enemies. He expected a bullet or a blade, or the cold vacuum of an airlock. Instead, Moro sat him down in a chair facing a screen. Then he played the footage. The same footage that had been shown in the human Senate. The cities of Vela Prime burning. The refugee ships coming apart. The laughter of the Dravasi commanders. The last transmission of the Valoran transport captain telling the children to close their eyes. Falvex watched it all. His expression did not change, because Arxelian faces were not built for expression. But his hands, resting on his knees, began to tremble. When the footage ended, Moro leaned forward until his face was close to the Arxelians. "You will remember what you did," he said quietly. "Every face, every name, every child. You will carry them for the rest of your life, and you will live with it. That is your punishment, not death, memory." There was nothing to say. Around Arxis Prime, the guns fell silent. The battle was over. The Council fleet was destroyed, and humanity stood in the ashes of the old order, waiting to build something new. The silence after the battle was the loudest thing Admiral Moro had ever heard. He stood on the bridge of the Remembrance and looked out at the space around Arxis Prime. It was filled with wreckage, broken ships, drifting debris, clouds of gas and metal that caught the light of the distant star and glowed like dying embers. Somewhere in that field of ruin were the remains of the fleet that had burned Vela Prime. Somewhere out there were the ships that had fired on unarmed refugees. They were scrap metal now, and Moro felt nothing about that. What he felt was tired. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He had won the battle. He had done what needed to be done. But winning did not bring back the dead. It never did. The surrender came within hours, not from the Arxelians alone, from the entire council. With their combined fleet destroyed and their capital surrounded, the remaining council members had no leverage and no options. Delegates from dozens of species began transmitting messages of capitulation, each one more desperate than the last. Some begged for mercy, some offered bribes, some tried to blame others for the Valoran genocide, pointing fingers at allies who had voted the same way they did. Morrow ignored the noise and waited for President Osei's instructions. The president had been clear from the beginning. This was not about revenge. This was not about conquest. Earth had no interest in ruling the galaxy. It had interest in making sure that what happened to the Valorans could never happen again. The terms were drafted aboard the Remembrance and presented to the Council without negotiation. They were called the Treaty of Vela's Ashes, and they were signed in a ceremony held in orbit above the scarred remains of Vela Prime itself. Every surviving Council species sent a representative. Many of them had to look down at the burned world below as they pressed their marks to the document. That was intentional. Morrow wanted them to see what their silence had allowed. The terms were firm but fair. The Galactic Council, in its old form, was dissolved. The institution that had allowed a handful of powerful species to control the lives of hundreds of others was gone. In its place, a new body was created, the Galactic Concord. Every species, regardless of size or strength, would have equal representation. Every founding member would hold veto power on military actions. No preemptive strike against a sovereign civilization would ever be authorized again without the unanimous consent of the full assembly. The Arxelian hegemony was stripped of its military authority for 100 years. Their fleet was reduced to a small defensive force, barely enough to patrol their own borders, and it would be monitored by joint human and allied inspection teams. The Arxelians accepted in silence. They had no choice. The Dravasi theocracy received the same treatment. Their warships were decommissioned. Their military leaders were removed from power. The Supreme Prelate, who had ordered the martyrdom charge and whose commanders had laughed while firing on refugee ships, was arrested and held for trial. He protested that he was a holy figure and could not be judged by lesser beings. No one listened. A joint tribunal was established to try those responsible for the Valoran genocide. It was not a human court. It was a galactic one, with judges drawn from 12 different species, including several who had been council members and had voted against the Valoran resolution. The trials lasted 8 months. Over 300 individuals were convicted, from the admirals who had ordered the bombardment to the officers who had commanded the containment patrols. Their sentences ranged from imprisonment to exile to permanent public record of their actions, so that their names would be remembered for what they had done for as long as records existed. Thalvex Orum was among those tried. He sat in the courtroom without expression, his yellow eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls. When he was asked to speak in his own defense, he said only one thing: "I believed they would not come." He was sentenced to life imprisonment on a monitored station, where he would spend his remaining years in a small room with a window that faced the stars. Stars that now belonged to a galaxy he no longer controlled. Earth was formally recognized as a Tier 1 civilization, the highest classification in the new Concord system. All previous restrictions on human military strength were lifted. No caps on fleet size, no limits on weapons development, no borders imposed by others. Humanity had earned its place, not through diplomacy or patience, but through the simple, terrible act of proving that it could not be pushed without pushing back harder than anyone imagined. But the most important part of the treaty was not about Earth. It was about the Valorans. All surviving Valoran territories were returned to Valoran sovereignty immediately. The council-appointed governors were removed. Reparations were mandated, massive transfers of resources, technology, construction materials, and labor from the species that had participated in the attack. The rebuilding of the Vela cluster was to be the largest reconstruction effort in galactic history, and every responsible party would contribute to it whether they wanted to or not. The rebuilding began almost immediately. Human engineers were the first to arrive. They came by the thousands: construction teams, architects, environmental specialists, medical staff. They landed on the scorched surface of Vela Prime and began to work. Valoran survivors who had been rescued from the ruins joined them, and together they started clearing the rubble and preparing the ground for new growth. It was slow work. The crystal cities could not simply be rebuilt with machines. Valoran architecture was alive. It grew from seeds planted in special soil, shaped by sound and light over months and years. But human engineers adapted. They built temporary shelters and hospitals first, practical structures to keep people safe, while the slower, deeper work of regrowing the crystal towers began. Volunteers came from every human colony world. Teachers came to help Valoran children who had lost their skulls. Doctors came to treat the wounded. Farmers came to help restore the agricultural lands that had been burned to ash. Artists came because they had seen images of the old Valoran cities and wanted to help bring that beauty back into the world. It was not charity. It was not obligation. It was simply what humans did when someone they cared about was hurting. Ambassador Lire Velshan returned to Vela Prime 6 months after the treaty was signed. She had not been back since the attack. She had not been sure she could bear it. She landed at the site of the old capital, where the greatest crystal towers had once stood. The ground was still black in places, scarred by heat and impact. But in the center of the clearing, surrounded by temporary human shelters and construction equipment, something was growing. A single bio-light tower, barely 10 meters tall, its surface glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed gently in the morning air. The first new growth on Vela Prime since the burning. Lire stood before it and watched the light pulse. Her skin, which had been dim and gray for months, began to glow again, faintly at first, then brighter, matching the rhythm of the tower. Tears ran down her face, leaving trails of soft gold light on her cheeks. Her daughter stood beside her, holding her hand. The girl had survived because she had been on Earth, studying at a school in Geneva on the day her world was destroyed. She was quiet, as she had been for a long time, but as she watched the tower glow, she leaned against her mother and whispered, "It is growing again." "Yes," Lire said, "it is." Admiral Morrow attended the memorial ceremony held on the anniversary of the attack. He stood in his dress uniform among a crowd of humans and Valorans, listening to a choir sing the same hymn of remembrance that he had heard on Mars a lifetime ago. The song was the same. Everything else had changed. After the ceremony, a Valoran elder approached him. She was old. Her bioluminescent skin faded to a pale silver, her movements slow and careful. She had survived the bombardment by hiding in an underground water system for 3 days, breathing through a cracked pipe while the world above her burned. She stopped in front of Morrow and looked up at him. Then she spoke in the old Valoran tongue, a series of soft clicks and hums that most translators struggled to render. But Morrow had learned enough over the years to understand. "You came," she said, "even when the stars said you would not. You came." Morrow, the man who had commanded the largest battle fleet in human history, who had broken the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever assembled, who had stared down the architects of genocide without flinching. That man had no words. His throat closed. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, slowly, and that was all he could manage. The elder reached up and placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. Her palm glowed faintly where it touched him. Then she turned and walked away into the crowd, and Morrow stood alone with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that would come next. In the months that followed, something unexpected began to happen across the galaxy. Small species, the ones who had been ignored, bullied, exploited, or forgotten by the old council, began reaching out to Earth, not for military protection, not for trade deals, for friendship. They had watched what humanity did. They had seen a species go to war, not for resources or territory or power, but because someone had hurt its friends. They had watched humans risk everything for a people who could offer them nothing in return except loyalty. And they wanted to stand beside that kind of fire. Messages arrived from species Earth had barely heard of, a race of small furry beings from the far rim, who had been forced to pay tribute to the Arxelians for generations. A collective of aquatic creatures from a water world who had been denied trading rights for centuries. A nomadic fleet species that had been hunted from system to system by Dravasi cleansing patrols, and had survived only by hiding. They all said variations of the same thing. We saw what you did. We want to be your friends. We want to be part of something where the strong protect the weak instead of crushing them. Earth welcomed them all, and on Vela Prime, as the crystal towers slowly grew back toward the sky, and the biolite gardens began to bloom again in colors that had not been seen for a year, a new proverb was added to the old Valoran books of wisdom. It was carved into the base of the memorial at the center of the new capital, written in both Valoran script and human English, so that every species who visited would understand. It read, "The stars are cold and uncaring, but somewhere among them there are humans, and humans remember."